This morning, our passage of Scripture is going to come from the book of 2 Samuel, starting in chapter 5. We're going to be looking at a very small instance in the life of King David. Now, you all will remember King David has more scriptures written about him than any other character except Jesus himself in the Bible. And I know that in previous years you all have done Bible studies with former pastors who have spent months upon King David, and I promise you that they probably did not exhaust all of the material. This morning we're just going to be looking at one very small instance because I think that there is a powerful truth, or a couple powerful truths, that will encourage you in your day-to-day walk. If you will, open your passage or look on the screen as we turn to 2 Samuel chapter 5, and we're beginning in verse 17. 2 Samuel 5, verse 17. Now when the Philistines had heard that they, being the people of Israel, had anointed David king over Israel, all of the Philistines went up to search for David. And David heard of it, and he went down to the stronghold. The Philistines also went and deployed themselves in the valley of Rephaim. So David inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you deliver them into my hand?" And the Lord said to David, "Go up, for I will doubtless deliver the Philistines into your hand." So David went to Baal Perazim. And David defeated them there, and he said, "The Lord has broken through my enemies before me, like a breakthrough of water." Therefore he called the name of that place Baal Perazim, which means the Lord of the breakthrough. And they left their images, their idols, their gods there. And David and his men carried them away. Then the Philistines went up once again and deployed themselves in the valley of Rephaim. Therefore David inquired of the Lord, and he said, "You shall not go up. Circle around behind them and come upon them in front of the mulberry trees. And it shall be, when you hear the sound of the marching in the top of the mulberry trees, then you shall advance quickly, for then the Lord will go out before you to strike the camp of the Philistines." And David did so, as the Lord commanded him, and he drove back the Philistines from Geba as far as Gezer. Many of you may have at least heard this story anecdotally, possibly in your Sunday school classes. Maybe even you've heard a sermon or two on it, because it's an interesting little story, especially when you're in children's church and you're trying to tell the stories that would capture their attention. David listening under the tops of trees for the angels of the Lord to go before him is quite an image. But there's something deeper in this passage than just God with us. That's an important and crucial element of our walk. But in order to really understand what's going on here, we have to stretch our minds a little bit and see what has happened before and what's happening after this story takes place. If you all will remember, David has spent nearly 16 years from the day that he was anointed as a shepherd boy until the day that he becomes king over the lands of Israel and Judah combined. And for many of those 16 years, he spent them running from the former king, who sought his life out of utter and absolute jealousy. Now, I don't know about you, but that is a very difficult idea to hold on to, that God gives you a promise that you're going to be something great, something powerful, something successful, something that he can use, whatever the promise God has given you, and then you spend 16 years waiting for God to deliver that promise. This is what David went through. And as we read through the scriptures, if you've done much of a study of his life, you see that there are days where David is fully trusting God in the midst of the caves and in the midst of the battle and in the midst of running for his own life and the possibility of starvation. He doesn't lose hope. But then there are also those days where David's hope falters, where he turns to God and he says, "My soul can bear this no more. You have afflicted me, and I don't understand why." But the one thing that set David apart from every other person that is mentioned in the scriptures is even in the bad times when he was overwhelmed by his circumstances, he never lost his praise. Even when he turned to God and said, I can't do this anymore, he would still recognize that God was mighty and powerful, and he submitted to him. He never rebelled against the Lord. He might have given up on the plan. He might have gotten frightened or depressed or overwhelmed, but he always trusted that God was still God and gave him the due praise. Now that leads us, that's 16 years of preparation in the desert, of preparing him to be king, of preparing him to lead a nation not in his own strength but in the Lord's strength, brings him to the point where first the southern tribe of Judah anoints him king over their own territory. It would be as if, imagine, David was given rights to be the governor of one state, but the other states had yet to acknowledge it. It took a few more years, but eventually all of the kingdom of Israel came to trust in the Lord's plan and anointed David king of the whole nation. This is what God had promised. It had taken nearly 16 years to get there, but God was faithful, and at the right time, and in the right way, and at the right place, God put David into the promised position that he had prepared him for. And at this point, David could look back and see that there was a point to those caves, and a point to that running, and a point to the days where food and water was hard to come by. He could see that God used all of his experiences in the wilderness to prepare him for this day when he became king over all. Because unlike his predecessor, David would lead this nation in righteousness, in holiness, and he would do so while expanding their borders and making them safe. And he knew that it would take God's help to do that. Now this is a great day of celebration. David has finally arrived at this moment where God has vindicated him. And immediately, something happens. One of the enemies that David has continually fought for the last 16 years, an enemy that the people of Israel just cannot defeat, named the Philistines. They hear that David is no longer just a king of a little small group of people, but he's king of the entire nation whom they hate. And they know that means one thing. That means now that David will have the backing of all of the people, and there is nothing that can stop him from destroying them, the Philistines. So before he can become king and reign in this new capital city called Jerusalem that he has built, before he can muster all the troops from all the different tribes, they say, we've got to take David out. So they send their armies. And David prepares himself for battle, for the first battle that he will have as the united king of Israel, or the king of united Israel. And he brings the troop, and they go down into this fortified valley. Now when it says the Valley of Rephaim, we don't really know much geography, especially when they use these ancient terms, but the Valley of Rephaim had very high cliffs on both sides. And they could position people on the tops of the cliffs, and they could position troops down in the bottom of the valley in such a way that anyone coming in was sure to be ambushed. David knew that this was a trap. And David did one thing that was important. Instead of relying on his own military strength or his own experience or the number of troops that he had, he did what? He inquired of the Lord. He asked God what the battle plan should be. When you go through something in your life, whether it's because you're waiting on a promise or because an attack has come or because a new circumstance has arisen that's overwhelming, is your first response to inquire of the Lord? I hope that it is. Many a times we would benefit from taking a moment to step back, to walk out of crisis mode and turn to prayer. Because you and I absolutely will try and figure out a problem on our own, but all we can see is this little circumstance in front of us. We cannot see the plan of God. We cannot see what holds tomorrow. We can't see what's around the corner. All we can see is what's directly in front of our face. And while the Lord has given us wisdom on this earth, it benefits us to turn to Him for additional wisdom, for the godly wisdom that is pure and holy and can see the future instead of just the present. So David turns to God and he says, shall we go up? And if we do, will we win? And the Lord says, go up, and surely today you will win. So David does. He goes into the valley with the Lord's permission, and he catches the Philistines off guard. They're not quite ready. And so they fight. He defeats a large portion of their army, and the rest of them retreat. They take the spoils of war. You notice it said that there were images that the Philistines dropped. This means there were little gold and silver statues of false gods. The Israelites would scoop those up. They would take them back and melt them down, and now they would be richer for the battle. So even in the midst of this attack, God provided them a blessing. Well, then the Philistines regroup. This is all in the same battle, but they regroup at the other end of the valley. And David, instead of charging forward, as you would imagine, he's got the enemy on the run, he stops and he says, we better ask God again what to do next. And this time the Lord says, don't go forward, but instead circle behind them and wait for the sound of the rustling of leaves. Because when you hear those mulberry trees begin to move, you will know that I am going before you to defeat them. Had David ignored his impression of God to pray, had David tried to decide this in his own strength, then we would have been tempted. We would have been tempted. He would have been tempted. God already gave him the direction. Why would you need to pray a second time? Because David was sensitive to the Lord. And he knew that the Lord was pulling on his heart to say, listen, my son, for my instruction, because things have changed. Had he plunged forward in his own strength, the armies of Israel would have been defeated. Because the Philistines had had time to put men up on the cliffs and to prepare that ambush. Instead, David followed God's advice. He came up behind them where they weren't expecting the Israelites to come. And then, as good measure, the Lord sent his own angelic armies to go before him and defeat the Philistines. Now you'll remember that theme is familiar. The last couple of weeks we've looked at places where God has done great and marvelous things on behalf of his people. And in many of those circumstances, he uses the angelic forces and he uses his divine power. But even if God had not sent the angel armies, he still did something that David had to do. He sent instruction, and David listened. This is the story. But what we don't see is what comes next. And what comes next in our text, in chapters 6 and 7, is that David, who has built this great capital in Jerusalem, now decides that it's time to bring the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence with their people, into the capital and build for it a grand temple, a house for God to reside in. Now it takes David many years to build that temple, but he does bring the ark. And this is a powerful and important step because it shows that David was prepared to make sure the people knew that God was just as important as the government, that God was just as involved in running the nation as David was, because if David was in the capital, God had to be in the capital too. Now, what does that mean? It means that if you look at this story, you see two themes. First, don't be surprised if the enemy attacks, either when God has delivered a promise or when he's bringing you into your next mission. Satan opposes any movement of God. There are times in your life when you're on the cusp of an answer to prayer that you've been waiting on for 15, 16, 23 years. Satan will do everything he can to steal your joy, to distract you, to hinder the answer. Hold fast like David did, because when God answers, it's going to be done. But don't be surprised when the enemy stirs up. If you see the enemy stirring up problems, if all of a sudden your vehicle breaks down and your microwave explodes and your stove dies and your dishwasher overflows and your washing machine smokes. And these are real things that happen in my life all in one day. When all of that goes awry at the same time, you can be assured that your enemy is angry. And that he's angry that God is about to do something for you. Hold fast to the promise. Just like David, the enemy came. Then the second thing is, if you're about to make a step for God, maybe you have felt the Lord pulling on your heart to get more serious about your faith. Maybe you feel the Lord pulling on your heart to reach out and to minister to someone, and you've been praying about it and you've been struggling with it, and finally you decide, you know what, today's the day. I'm gonna make an effort to start going to Sunday school. Or I'm going to get serious about getting in my scriptures. Or I'm going to be confident and carve out that hour a day for Bible reading and prayer. Or I'm going to go and join with that ministry and start ministering to people in need. Whatever that movement is that God has been leading you to, the moment you take a step, I assure you, your enemy is going to be angry. David was about to do something great for God, and the enemy came. David had just received the promise of God, and the enemy came. But in both circumstances, God was there. Yes, he faced the trial. Yes, he had a battle, but he was victorious. And why was he victorious? Because David, who had spent 16 years in the desert with the Lord, knew that if he would listen to the counsel of God, God would bring him through any trial, any battle, any attack that the enemy could throw at him. Church, I'm speaking to you all today from a story from 3,000 odd years ago. But it's just as relevant today. You and I won't face the Philistines, but we will face trials. We will face battles. We will face hardships. We will face circumstances that threaten to overwhelm us. When those days come, take the advice of David and inquire of the Lord. Listen for his instruction, and the moment that you are confident that he has given you guidance, obey. And if you're not confident, keep praying. And if you take a step that you feel like you need more direction, go back and pray some more. You can never pray too much. God will assure your heart, step by step, that you're walking in the path that he's laid out. And the thing is this, he assures you the victory if you listen and follow his counsel. We do live in a world where we are at odds with our enemy Satan. There are many preachers who pretend like Satan is either just a story or he may be real, but Jesus defeated him, so we don't have to worry. The truth of the matter is you and I are in a battle daily. The difference is God promises us the victory if we will but listen and follow his lead. Otherwise, we face the enemy on our own. This morning, I encourage you, take heart, take counsel, but most importantly, seek the guidance of the Lord.